This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello everyone and welcome to another video, and also welcome to another ranking video. Today I'm going to be ranking every single fantasy book I've ever read. I sat down, actually typed out every fantasy book that I can remember that I've read. Now there's a lot I think that I've left off during high school that I have like weird fever dream-esque memories of, but I can't remember the titles. Anyway, these are all the fantasy books that I read that I can remember, and it turns out there are 85 books on this list for me to rank today. Before we get into the video, just a few sandbagging notes, just a few little preemptive things I want to say. If you want to skip this rambly little section and go straight to the video, hop to this time here, but otherwise I will just make a few points. So number one, I almost didn't make this video because I sat down and I was like, how have you only read 85 fantasy books? Fantasy is my absolute favorite genre. It's the most influential genre to me, and it's the genre I write in. And so I sat there and looked at my list of 85 books, and my brain was like, 85 isn't enough. 85 books is not enough books. You need more books. My brain really had the gall to be like, only 85 books? You're not a true fantasy fan. I decided to film the video anyway because in 2022, we're doing our best to ignore imposter syndrome. Point number two, I was genuinely surprised that there was only 85 books just because of how much reading I do now, but I think it's kind of indicative of the fact that A, I reread books a lot, B, I DNF books a lot, C, I didn't really start reading the volume of books that I read now until the last couple of years, and D, I make a really big effort to read widely outside of my genre. So I read a lot of nonfiction books and historical fiction books and contemporary and translation and all of these different kinds of things, because I think it's important if I want to write in one genre that I read widely to learn and get a good understanding of the other stuff. Point number three, there are going to be some fantasy purists who click on this video who are like, why isn't Robert Jordan on here? Where is Brandon Sanderson? Insert other influential epic fantasy novelist here. I am making more of an effort this year to actually delve into the realm, fantasy pun, of epic fantasy. Essentially, here is my long list TBR. It has 100 books on it. I only just read Lord of the Rings. I'm reading as fast as I can. And number four, the last little point I wanted to make before getting into this video. If I didn't have to worry about SEO and clickability when titling a YouTube video, this video would probably be titled Ranking Every Speculative Literature Book I've Ever Read Excluding Sci-Fi. This isn't just going to be pure fantasy, like pure high fantasy, secondary world fantasy. This is going to be everything speculative I've read that contains magic. And so we have magical realism here, we have some paranormal here, obviously high fantasy is going to be here. Oh, I just thought of another one actually. Point number five, taste is 100% subjective. So if I give a book a really high rating, that doesn't mean that's definitively the best book in the world. If I give a book a low rating, it doesn't mean that's the worst book in the world. It doesn't mean that it's a bad book. This is just entirely based on how much I personally enjoyed these books. As I mentioned with the last ranking video, please don't be upset with me if I've taken your favorite book and I've given it a low place. Just because I have doesn't mean it's a bad book, doesn't invalidate your feelings and tastes. And anyway, let's jump into the video. Hello and welcome to my desk. Let's get started on ranking these books because there's a lot of books to get through today. I'm going to be trying to rank these in order of when I read them. So starting with the very first books that I can remember having read. Just quickly, I'm going to explain my tiers. So God tier, this is 5 stars. These are my favorite books ever. They're books that I reread. Very good is exactly what it says on the tin. It's books that I think are very good. Enjoyable but could have been better are my 3-star books. If I give a book 3 stars, I still think it's a good serviceable book. It was fine means that the book was serviceable, that it had like elements that were reasonably good, but it's just that I didn't personally love it. I didn't think it was groundbreaking or super duper memorable. Not for me are books that I just really didn't enjoy. Like there's not very many on this list, but there needed to be a category for wasn't to my taste really. Now the very first book that I'm going to rank is no surprise to anyone because it's Harry Potter. Here sits right in God tier. I basically learned to read off of this book, and then the next 7 books are all the Harry Potter books. So I'm just going to chuck them in order. We're already at the point where I need my glasses. I think I want to put the first one first, then the 7th one, 6th one, 3rd one, then the 4th one, then the 2nd one, then the 5th one. The 5th one is my least favorite of all the Harry Potter books. The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy. I didn't own a lot of books when I was a kid, and I loved Harry Potter, and so I reread it and I reread it and I reread it because it was the only book series I actually owned. Even though I went to the library a lot, I just ended up rereading Harry Potter so often. And after Harry Potter finished, I wanted more magical stuff to read. And so I ended up being given The Worst Witch. It's not very memorable to me, but I remember enjoying it a lot. And then the next book I got recommended at the bookstore, actually, I think when I was around 12, is this book, which is the Chrestomanci series first book. This is by Diana Wynne Jones. It's called A Charmed Life. This had such a wonderful plot twist when I was 12 reading it. My mind was absolutely blown. I thought it was amazing. I just thought it was so absolutely incredible. I'm just gonna pop Order of the Phoenix down here. Book number 10, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I tell you what, I can't remember the first time I read this book. I've reread it so many times. I'm just assuming I read it at some point between the ages 10 and 15. So I'm just gonna chuck it in here. And then moving on to the book series that was really significant to me during high school, and this was Twilight. So I was in year 9 when I read the first Twilight book, and I borrowed it from a friend. I borrowed all of the books from a friend. So year 9 was 2010 was when I read this book, so far out. That's 12 years ago. But where does I really want to reread Twilight soon. I'm gonna put Twilight here just for nostalgia factor. I remember really enjoying this book when I was 14, and then I was one of those like teenagers who ended up really hating Twilight when I got to about like 16, 17. And now coming back to it, I really want to reread it. So I'm going to sit it under very good just because of how much I enjoyed it as a 14-year-old. I think I'll put New Moon in the very good category, but I think Eclipse and Breaking Dawn weren't as influential to me. Number 15, and the last book I remember reading as a teenager, is The Goddess Test by Amy Carter. Gonna go ahead and pop this one in here. I already really enjoyed Greek mythology by this point. I think I read this when I was 16, and I remember reading it and thinking that it was just unrealistic and just inconsistent with what I'd read about Greek mythology, and there were just so many things about the plot I thought was unbelievable and I didn't enjoy at the time. So that's the first book in the not for me category. Now, these are all the magical fantasy books that I can remember reading as a child. However, before we jump into the next books, the books I read as an adult, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is a website builder which allows people to create dynamic, interesting, and beautiful websites with ease. As many of you are aware, I made my website through Squarespace. I honestly couldn't be happier with how quick and simple it was to put together initially, and also how easy it is to update it and keep it looking lovely now. Squarespace has loads of benefits which make it easy to show off the things that you make and to connect with the people who are interested in visiting your site. Squarespace has powerful blogging tools so you can categorize, share, and schedule posts, and also has wonderful analytics features to help you understand the people who are visiting your website. If you're looking to make a website, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Christy and Jones to save 10% off your purchase of a website or domain. We're now jumping into me going to university. So I started university when I was 17, just about to be 18, 2014. Looking at my list here, I did not read a single fantasy book that year. And now correlation doesn't equal causation, but 2014 was kind of the worst year of my life. So like 2015, the very first one I read is The Last Illusion by Purchester Kapoor. I had to read this for a creative writing class. I'm going to pop it in here just because I know that this is a speculative novel, but I can't remember exactly what makes it speculative. Maybe it's the fact that the boy had wings. I can't remember. The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland and Ship of Her Own Making by Catherine M. Valenti. I enjoyed this one. I recommend this book all the time because I think it's really, really beautiful. I think it's a nice sort of more modern take on Alice in Wonderland. Ghostwriter by John Harwood. This is a South Australian author, which is the reason why I think we were told to read this book for my Gothic literature course. I'm going to pop this in the It Was Fine category. He's not actually a ghostwriter. He is a writer, I think, and there are ghosts in the story. But again, not super memorable. So The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a really good, short, creepy little book. Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I remember this plot very, very clearly. I think it was a very like evocative story and obviously very influential. However, I remember not loving it. I will trust past Christy and her opinions and pop it in the It Was Fine category. I think I would appreciate it more now. Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton. I remember enjoying this at the time. I remember I read it because I was reading a lot of really like heavy literature books and I wanted something a bit calmer and easier to read, and so I picked up this YA book. I don't remember anything about the plot, but I remember enjoying reading it at the time. She's a sharpshooter. No, I remember that. Okay, well, I'm going to put this in the enjoyable but could have been better just because I don't remember it. So the end of 2016, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. We'll just pop that at the end. 2017 is the first year of my postgrad. So the very first book I read was Red Queen, and I think I read this on the plane to Beijing, and I'm gonna go ahead and chuck this here. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I definitely read this on the plane because I remember seeing the shot of it from my vlog. I think I read this on the plane to Seoul and I loved this book. Orlando is such a wonderful magical realism book. It's hard because it's like the books I've enjoyed the most in my childhood were Harry Potter, and so the most joy I've ever gotten out of reading was from Harry Potter, but Orlando was definitively a better book. If I'm like thinking really critically. But this video is not necessarily about me being critical, it's about me ranking how much I enjoyed these books. Okay, I'm gonna put this here for now and I might change it later. A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This is the first book I ever read by V.E. Schwab. I enjoyed it. I think I hyped it myself for a really long time. I pre-ordered this book. I was so excited for it. I'd heard a lot of amazing stuff about it. And then it was good. It was really good, but it wasn't quite as enjoyable as I wanted. Although that being said, out of this series, I think I enjoyed the first one the most. I also think that I would appreciate this book a lot more now if I reread it, and so I would like to reread this at some point. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. This is the first Murakami magical realism book that I read. A masterpiece of a book. I read this book the first week or second week we moved to Japan, and we moved to Japan during the summertime, and it was a heat wave and I got heat exhaustion, and this book is set during the summertime in Japan, and it was the most like evocative reading experience I think I've ever had. So I'm gonna put the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle here. A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. I think his characterization is particularly strong and I really did enjoy this book. So I'm gonna put this in very good. The Hobbit, J.R.R. Tolkien. This is a very, very good one. The Time Traveler's Wife. This is a good book, but I remember not loving it at the time when I read it. So I'm gonna pop this book in the it was fine category. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think this is a really ambitious novel. I think it's not as magical as I would have wanted from a story like this. It's sort of like a literary fantasy that's about memory and this couple who are trying to remember what happened to their son, and they go on a journey, and it's really cool and really interesting, and I'm glad that I read it, but it's not I remember not loving it because I didn't feel like the story was as engaging as I wanted. We're now on to 2018, so at this point we're still living in Japan. All the books I'm reading are on my Kindle. First one is The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I started reading in 2017 on the train to Mount Takao. Dorian Gray is one of my favorite novels of all time. I love Dorian Gray. Such a beautiful, brilliant gothic story. A Gathering of Shadows. I did like the first book much better than the second and third books. I felt like the second and third books were really, really rushed. I remember that I think my main problem with the books was Leela Bard. I think I didn't really like her characterization very much. And that being said, I love V.E. Schwab. I think she's such a talented human being here. These two, so the second and third books. Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. The very first time I read this, I was catching the train to my job as a teacher. Peter Pan is excellent. I love it. There's a lot of problematic, outdated stuff in Peter Pan, but it's such a magical story. Howl's Moving Castle. The very first time I read this book, I went to the bookstore next to Shinjuku Station and I bought it there. It was like one of the only books I bought when I lived in Japan, and I can't believe I waited so long to read this book because I had loved the film for so many years beforehand. Oh, it's so difficult. This is why when I talk about my favorite fantasy books, I always put Harry Potter in place 0 because I feel like it's a cop-out to put Harry Potter first. But if I'm being really honest in terms of the books that have given me the most joy in my life, Harry Potter, it sits in first place because I've reread it so many times. The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is a book I read right at the end of 2018. I'm gonna pop it next to Dorian Gray, I think. Killing Commendatore by Haruki Murakami. This is the only novel I've ever been sent by a publisher. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. Killing Commendatore is a little bit more laid back, so I end up recommending this one to people if they are a little bit intimidated by the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle here, I think. Now we are on to 2019, so we're getting to the point right before the world ended. Instructions by Neil Gaiman is the very first one, and this goes... this could potentially go here. Nah, it's going here. Okay, Instructions by Neil Gaiman. It kind of reads like a really long poem, and it's for children, and it's kind of like the instructions on growing up, but it's not in a very fantastical way. This is genuinely one of my favorite pieces of writing I've ever come across in my life. Like it is so magical. It's so beautiful. When I'm sad, I listen to the audio of this. It makes me feel so comforted and inspired and creative. I love Instructions. The Graveyard Book. This was 2019 was the year I started reading Neil Gaiman's books. And so I'll pop The Graveyard Book here because I think The Graveyard Book is my favorite novel by Neil Gaiman. Coraline, I also love. To be clear, I love Coraline to bits, and so it's still God tier, but I think it's closer to here. The Ocean at the End of the Lane probably sits next to Coraline, I would think. Here. And that is actually 2019 done. I only read 4 fantasy books and they're all by Neil Gaiman. 2020, this is the time when my reading really starts picking up. So kicking it off with Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I started reading this at the end of 2019, but I think finished it right at the beginning of 2020. I really enjoyed this one. It's a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. I think it's a beautiful, wintry, cozy story. Here, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I love circus-themed stuff. It's an aesthetic that I really, really enjoy. And so I really wanted to enjoy this book, but I think the characterization and the character journeys aren't nearly as strong as the setting is. I am popping this in the enjoyable but could have been better category. A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Surprisingly engaging. Surprisingly, I mostly read it because I thought it would be funny to read it. I wasn't expecting to like it because of all the jokes I'd seen that were made about this book. I'm going to put this here in the enjoyable but could have been better category because the book, as I said, was surprisingly engaging. The plot ramped up towards the end of the story, although if I were to sit down and pick apart everything I didn't like about this book, we'd be sitting here for a while. Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This was a gift. A friend gave this to me on my birthday. I thought it was a really good gothic little YA story. Nights at the Circus by Angela Carter. I really liked this one about a young woman who has wings, who is an aerialist, and she can fly. Here? Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I think this is the first book I read in lockdown once the world decided to set itself on fire. I remember just like walking around like during like the early weeks of the pandemic listening to this book on audio and needing to feel calm. It was so much fun. It was so engaging. It was exactly what I needed at the time to de-stress. It is going to go at the very top of very good. Priory of the Orange Tree. I love this novel. It's such an interesting epic story, and I think it has some of the most amazing world building that I've ever seen, some of the most fleshed out settings I've ever seen. The issue with this book, the reason why it's not like up higher is because I think some of the pacing is off in the novel. I feel like there are parts that drag. I feel like it's a little bit challenging to get into the story, although it's more common with epic fantasy that they take a little bit longer to get into it, and because it's a bigger story, it's more world building and more setting up of the characters and the plot and all that kind of stuff. But definitively, it's an excellent book. Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, such a good book. Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Sort of in terms of like Neil Gaiman's books, this is like mid-tier Neil Gaiman for me. I'm actually re-listening to it at the moment, and I think I'm enjoying it more on the second time round, so this might actually go up a little bit higher. I'm starting to not trust myself in terms of like the ranking. I know how subjective this is. I know that if I did this ranking on a different day, I'd put these books in slightly different places. So please just take this with a pinch of salt. Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. I enjoyed this book. I enjoyed reading it. I really loved Spinning Silver, as I've already mentioned, by Naomi Novik, but I struggled to connect with the main character of this book. So I'm going to chuck this in enjoyable but could have been better. Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is a time traveling story, another time traveling story, but I enjoyed this a lot more than Time Traveler's Wife. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I think this is an excellent fantasy book. I think it's one of my favorite fantasy books I've ever read in terms of like pure fantasy, secondary world, high fantasy. So beautifully written. The settings are really cool. A really brilliant fleshed out world. Here. The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. This sort of falls into a weird category because it's like a contemporary. It's fantasy. It has speculative elements in it because it's a woman who is about to die and she goes back and she gets to sort of like relive and fix her mistakes and all that kind of stuff. But it's sort of like that really, really light commercial fantasy that people read even if they don't like reading fantasy. It takes a protagonist who has depression and sort of hands her the solution for it in a way that I didn't particularly like. This is so close to being here just because of how mental illness was treated in the book. But I'm gonna pop it here. Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. This is the very first book in the His Dark Materials series. I was blown away by how much I loved this, how much I loved the writing. It's gonna go next to House Moving Castle. And that is the last book for 2020. We're now finally on to 2021. The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. This is my favorite book that I read last year. But in terms of my overall fantasy list, where does it go? I'm gonna put it here. The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I'm actually going to put this above The House in the Cerulean Sea, even though I read them both in the same year, just because I think if we're purely talking about fantasy, I think this is such a wonderfully done story. I think the characterization is very good. I think the world building is very good. And I think the way that this book blends elements from sci-fi with fantasy is really innovative. There's so many things I love about this story. The story plays around with narrative and voice, and it's so good. It's so good. Here, Obelisk Gate, I'm gonna pop a bit lower though. Stone Sky I'm gonna pop here as well. Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. I enjoyed the story, but I wish I enjoyed it more, so I think it's gonna go here. The Lives of Christopher Champ by Diana Wynne Jones. This is the second book in the Crestomancy series, and it doesn't nearly live up to the first book. Wonderfully written, it's very magical, but it's not quite as good. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is one of my favorite books of all time now. I love this story so much. It's so cool. Or maybe above Dorian Gray. Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne Jones. This is the sequel to House Moving Castle. It's not in any capacity a sequel, although it is set after House Moving Castle and there are characters from House Moving Castle in the book. This is mostly a retelling of the Arabian Nights. Here, Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. There were quite a few YA tropes used in this book. I felt like there were a few things that were just done kind of predictably compared to what I would have liked to have read with the book. The second book is Siege of Storm, which I thought was better, and then Ruin and Rising, which I thought was better again. Lonely Castle in the Mirror by Mizuki Tsujimura. This is a really, really wonderful novel translated from Japanese, which draws from fairy tales. I loved the social commentary in this. I loved how emotionally impactful this was. So I'm gonna chuck this here. The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This is a good, cozy, witchy sort of story. I wanted the meaning of the story to be a little bit deeper, but otherwise I thought it was a good, enjoyable little read. Here. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Basically a Regency novel like Pride and Prejudice, but add in magic. And this book goes here. I'm finding it really interesting. House in the Cerulean Sea has ended up here, but the other books I've read in the same year, I feel like they deserve to be higher, even though this was my favorite book I read last year. This is the book I enjoyed the most. But from a fantasy perspective, I feel like these other books deserve to be higher just because they're so much... they're more unique, I think, to me. Little Knife by Philip Pullman. I finally read the second book back here. And Amber Spyglass, the final book in His Dark Materials, I'm gonna chuck here. Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of the myths of Circe, who is one of the most influential like witch figures we have in Western storytelling. I'm gonna pop this in the very good category. I think I like the writing style of Neverwhere better, but I like the story of Circe better. The Familiars by Stacey Halls. This is another good witchy story that I read around Halloween, which tells the story of... hang on a second. I'm trying to remember if there's any actual magic in here. I think the magic... should this be on this list? I think the magic is alluded to. If anyone's read this book recently and they're just like yelling at me for having forgotten a really important part, I'm so sorry. Here. American Gods by Neil Gaiman. As it turns out, this is my least favorite Neil Gaiman novel that I have read. Really, I had to push myself through so many parts of this book, so really it should be here, just in terms of like the pacing and my ability to connect with the main character and to enjoy. The Nature of Witches by Rachel Griffin. I'm probably not the target audience for this particular book. There are a few things I didn't particularly love, like I wanted the setting to be more fleshed out. I didn't identify with the characters. I reckon I'll put it here. The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman by Angela Carter. My least favorite Angela Carter novel, as it turns out. Again, a lot of amazing things in here, but just a few elements that stopped me from enjoying it. I didn't enjoy reading it nearly as much as I've enjoyed reading her other books, so I'm gonna put this one here, I think. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of the myth of Achilles and Patroclus. I'm gonna pronounce his name correctly this time. Patroclus, not Patroclus. Doesn't need to be an additional syllable there. This book made me cry my absolute eyes out. I loved it to bits. Where does it go though? The Lord of the Rings. So towards the end of last year, I read all of the Lord of the Rings books, and I know I've gotten so many questions from people who have been like, do you like Lord of the Rings more than Harry Potter now? And where do you rank Lord of the Rings? Okay, so we'll start with Fellowship of the Ring, which is the first one. I think this book series is brilliantly written. I can't even begin to describe how influential this book is and how much of a masterpiece it is in terms of world building and storytelling and so many things. But this is a ranking video where we're speaking about my personal enjoyment. I think it's going to go at the bottom of God tier. Maybe Fellowship of the Ring goes here, actually. Fellowship of the Ring goes here, then Obelisk Gate, then Stone Sky, then Return of the King, then Two Towers. I think that's fair. Please don't yell at me. If Cats Disappeared from the World by Genki Kawamura. If it wasn't for the ending making the book a bit better, it probably would have gone here, because the book, there were parts of the book that I thought were very repetitious, and I don't know if that was the translation or if that was the writing. The ending saved it a bit for me, so it's gonna go here. Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. I did not enjoy it nearly as much as The House in the Cerulean Sea though. I felt like the overall meaning of the story was quite a bit more cliched. Here. And then the final fantasy book I've read, which I just finished, which you would have watched if you watched my last vlog, and that is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Here, like in terms of literary merit, it should go really, really high, but in terms of my personal enjoyment, I love all of these books, and so it's really hard for me to decide. That is everything. All 85 books have been ranked. As I've mentioned, take this with a grain of salt, because I think that there are quite a few books here that, depending on my mood, depending on the day, will probably shift around a little bit. Whenever I do these ranking videos, I start to question if maybe I'm a bit too generous with my rankings, but it feels like reasonable. I think all of these books are brilliant. All of these books are 5 stars. All of these books are amazing and my favorites, and I will reread them, and I love them very, very much. And so this sort of feels about right to me. But yes, in the end, this is my ranked list of the 85 magical/fantasy books that I've read in the last, well, in my entire lifetime. I'm glad I filmed this video now, actually, because if I filmed this video like a year from now, the video would have been even longer. So I think it's good that I filmed this at this point. Thank you guys so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And also an enormous thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my channel. Over on Patreon, we have a whole bunch of lovely bonus content. So if you're interested in checking it out, please feel free to click the link in the description down below. Take care, everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.